19-year-old Ada Birch walked into a local livestock auction with $61 in her coat pocket and bought every broken, defective, rejected turkey in the room. It cost her exactly $22. 2 years later, that single $22 purchase turned into an agricultural empire with a waitlist of luxury buyers and a line of cars stretching all the way down a rural dirt road. Here is exactly how she executed the ultimate budget flip using assets everyone else laughed at, and why the things the market calls wrong are usually the only ones actually worth buying. We are moving fast. The morning of the sale, there were 31 turkeys sitting in a pen that nobody wanted. They were not sick. They were not dying. They were just wrong. They were wrong in that very specific, highly visible way that makes professional auctioneers shake their heads and makes buyers keep their hands shoved deep in their pockets. You have to understand the modern agricultural market to understand why this matters. The agricultural market is absolutely ruthless. It is an industrial machine that demands total conformity. Commercial buyers want a bird that hits a highly specific weight by a highly specific date, and they want it to do that reliably, uniformly, and without inconveniencing a single soul on the assembly line. These 31 birds had apparently missed that instruction entirely. They were way too small for commercial processing. They were way too uneven for the glossy holiday catalogs. There was one Tom sitting in the back with a drooping wing that rested against his body at a strange angle. It looked like he had a disagreement with gravity that he never quite managed to resolve. Another one had a head so pale it almost looked bleached. Medically, that meant absolutely nothing, but it looked wrong to everyone who looked at it. And in a commodity market, looking wrong is more than enough to get you blacklisted. Then there were 3 of them that were a color nobody in the room could even put a name to. They were not the standard bronze of a broad-breasted bird. They were not the pristine white of the factory birds. They were something entirely different, an oxidized copper color, green and brown and rich, and slightly unreal. The auction catalog had just labeled them as non-standard coloring and left it at that. The rest of the flock was just undersized. Cecil Boone had been running that livestock auction outside of Granger, Tennessee, for 23 years. He knew the room before the bidding even started. He knew it the way a preacher knows a congregation, just by reading the quality of the silence and the angle of the bodies leaning against the rail. On that cold morning in late September, the silence in the room was the heavy, undeniable silence of people who had already made up their minds. The market had spoken. The assets were worthless. Then Ada Birch walked in. She was 19. She had just driven 40 minutes from her family's place on Cutter Creek Road in a beat-up truck her uncle had sold her for $400. She strongly suspected he sold it to her for that price because he knew something about the transmission that she didn't. She had a great-aunt back home named Clotilde who was 81 years old, kept a kitchen garden, had opinions about absolutely everything, and kept most of those opinions completely to herself. That just made the ones she did share carry a ridiculous amount of weight. And Ada had a specific trait. People who knew her always said she had a very strange way of looking at something nobody else wanted and asking a question that just didn't occur to normal people. The question she asked, standing right in front of those 31 turkeys that the entire room had collectively decided were completely worthless, was incredibly simple. She looked at Cecil Boone and asked what they weighed right now. Cecil looked at her. He said they averaged 8 or 9 pounds, but they would gain. Ada looked at the Tom with the drooping wing. She looked at the pale-headed bird. She looked at the 3 oxidized copper birds sitting in the corner. They were staring back at her with that alert, highly considerate attention that turkeys get when they are trying to figure something out. She didn't flinch. She just looked back at Cecil and asked what he would take for the entire lot. The room noticed. Small rooms always notice. A man named Harwell Pitts, who farmed 200 acres just east of Granger and had been coming to Cecil's auction since before Ada was even born, turned away from the coffee table. He stared at the 19-year-old girl standing in front of the misfit pen. He didn't say a single word yet. He was the kind of guy who collected his observations quietly before he decided to spend them. 2 younger guys near the back of the room just exchanged a look. It was the kind of look that completely eliminated the need for words. Cecil Boone leaned over the rail and named his price. $22 for the lot. Ada didn't negotiate. She didn't hesitate. She just reached into her coat pocket, counted out $22 on the auction rail, and executed a textbook case of arbitrage. Arbitrage is a term Wall Street guys use all the time, but it applies perfectly here. It just means buying an asset in a market where it is deeply undervalued simply because it doesn't fit the standard, rigid constraints of that specific market. Financial institutions do it with distressed debt and weird derivatives. Ada did it with crooked turkeys. She bought an asset for pennies simply because the local farmers couldn't see past the packaging. Cecil took the cash. He wrote out the paperwork with the exhausted expression of a man who has seen things go in a million different directions and has completely stopped trying to predict which way they will actually go. Harwell Pitt stood there and watched her start loading those heavy wooden crates into the back of her questionable truck. He finished his coffee. He set the styrofoam cup down on the table. And then he turned to the guy standing next to him and said, loudly enough for people to hear, that the girl just bought every wrong turkey in the county. He laughed. He said Thanksgiving was going to be real interesting. He meant it as a joke. He meant it as a solid prediction of total failure. She just bought the most broken assets in the county. But here is the massive problem Ada was facing. Thanksgiving was exactly 8 weeks away. She got the birds back to the Birch Place on Cutter Creek Road by 2 in the afternoon. The property was 22 acres. That is just enough land to feel like a real farm, but not quite enough to actually run one the way the massive commercial neighbors ran theirs. It was just Ada and her great-aunt Clotilde out there. Clotilde walked out onto the porch. She was wearing a heavy barn coat and house shoes. She wore them together without a single ounce of apology because when you are 81 years old, and you have spent your entire life working land, you have absolutely earned the right to dress entirely for practicality. She stood there on the porch for a long, silent moment, just staring at the crates in the truck bed. She asked what was wrong with them. Ada looked back at her and said nothing was wrong with them, they were just built different. Clotilde looked at the tom with the drooping wing. He was looking back at her through the wooden slats with an expression of intense, dignified patience. She looked at the pale bird. She looked at the 3 copper ones. She repeated the phrase built different. She didn't say it like she believed it. She said it the way you repeat a piece of information you are carefully placing on a mental shelf to examine later. Ada told her they only cost $22. Clotilde looked at Ada, looked back at the birds, and told her she was going to need to fix the old turkey pen on the east side of the barn because the wire was completely gone at the bottom. Then she turned around and walked back inside. This is where the concept of sweat equity completely takes over the math. Ada didn't go to a commercial supply store and dump thousands of dollars into brand new infrastructure. She leveraged the existing real estate. The old turkey pen hadn't actually held a turkey since 2009. It was full of field mice and a rusted tiller. She spent 2 entire days clearing it out. She went to the local co-op and bought new hardware cloth for the bottom wire. It cost her exactly $14. She now had $36 total invested in this massive business experiment. She reset 3 heavy wooden fence posts that were leaning over. She raked out the dirt floor. She spread fresh wood shavings she found abandoned in the back of the barn. She used what was already there. When you start a business with almost zero capital, your time has to subsidize your wallet. You bleed sweat instead of bleeding cash. The birds moved into the pen on a Wednesday evening. They walked out of those crates with the cautious, heavy authority of animals conducting a very formal inspection of new premises. The tom with the drooping wing, who Ada had officially started calling Duke because he carried himself with this air of ruined dignity, made a complete, slow circuit of the pen before he did anything else. The 3 copper birds moved together in a tight, loose cluster. They would continue to move like that for the rest of their lives. By the time October rolled around, the weather turned cool and clear. Ada rigged up some completely improvised, ugly, but highly functional portable fencing out in the back pasture. She opened the gates. The birds poured out into the grass. And this is where the biological return on investment started compounding. You have to realize that commercial, factory farm turkeys are essentially biological machines. They are bred to sit in massive, climate-controlled warehouses, eat a heavily engineered diet of uniform corn and soy, and swell up to 20 pounds in an incredibly fast 14 weeks. Their legs can barely support their own weight. They do not forage. They do not run. They just consume and expand. Ada's birds were completely different. They were heritage hybrids. They moved through that back pasture with the purposeful, intense attention of animals that actually took their job seriously. Their job was to find absolutely every single edible thing within reach and eradicate it. Duke ranged out as far as any of them, holding his drooping wing at a slight angle to minimize the drag. The copper birds were relentless. They were always working the hardest patches of dirt, pulling up roots, hunting insects, eating wild clover and heavy native grasses. This is not just a nice story about happy animals. This is hard economic biology. When a bird constantly moves and eats a wildly varied diet of insects and native pasture, it completely rewrites the cellular makeup of the animal. It completely changes the lipid profile. The fat composition alters drastically, pulling in massive amounts of omega-3 fatty acids. The muscle density changes because the bird is actually using its legs to run. Ada was trading the speed of a factory for the undeniable, premium quality of nature. The birds were gaining weight slower than the commercial monsters at the grocery store, but they were gaining it steadily. The foundation was rock solid. Have you ever looked at a market and realized everyone was running in the exact wrong direction just because it was the fastest way to the finish line? Let me know in the comments below, because that exact mindset is usually where the biggest opportunities are hiding. Ada kept a meticulous notebook of their feed ratios and their daily ranging habits. One evening, Clotilde watched them out the kitchen window. She told Ada that her late husband Earl used to say you could always tell a good turkey just by how it walked. She said a good bird walked like it actually had somewhere to be. Not rushed. Just purposeful. Ada looked out at the pasture. Duke was marching the fence line. The coppers were aggressively working the soil under the old apple tree. She realized every single bird she bought walked exactly like that. The birds were doing great. But Ada was about to do something with her pricing strategy that was going to make the entire town think she had completely lost her mind. It started with Harwell Pitts. He was the guy from the auction who predicted her failure. He ran into her at the co-op in Granger on a random Saturday in late October. He asked if those wrong turkeys were still living. She told him all 31 were alive and well. He looked at her like a man slowly revising a mental estimate. He asked what she planned to do with them. She looked him dead in the eye and said she was going to sell them dressed for Thanksgiving. Harwell got quiet. He told her that people around here buy commercial birds. He didn't say it like he was arguing with her. He stated it like it was a law of physics. He reminded her that the local grocery store sold frozen turkeys for 39 cents a pound. 49 cents if they weren't on sale. Ada told him she knew the market rates. Harwell asked her what she was planning to charge. Ada said $20 a pound. Harwell set his bag of feed down. He stared at her. He said that was 4 times the grocery price, at minimum. Ada didn't blink. She said it was. Harwell told her she had better be right about those birds, and he walked away. What Ada was doing here is leveraging the psychology of a Veblen good. This is a crucial business concept. Most people think if you lower your price, you sell more. In a race to the bottom, the cheapest guy always wins. That is true for commodities. But a Veblen good completely breaks that rule. A Veblen good is an item where demand actually increases as the price goes up. When you price a product exponentially higher than the standard market rate, you are no longer just selling meat. You are selling a signal. You are signaling extreme scarcity. You are signaling uncompromising authenticity. You rip the product entirely out of the cheap commodity category, and you force the consumer to evaluate it on a completely different tier of value. If she charged 80 cents a pound, people would just compare her to the frozen 39-cent bird and think she was a rip-off. By charging $20 a pound, she eliminated the comparison entirely. She didn't run a single Facebook ad. She didn't print a single flyer. She didn't buy local radio time. She just casually mentioned her $20 price tag to Patsy Reeves. Patsy ran the register at the local gas station. Patsy knew absolutely everyone in the county. Patsy knew everyone's business before they even knew it themselves. Ada told Patsy she was selling pasture-raised birds from the old Birch place for $20 a pound. Patsy looked at her over her glasses. She remembered Ada's great-uncle Earl. She said Earl's turkeys were the best she ever had. She said she would take one, and she said she would mention it to a few people. That was the spark. Patsy was the most efficient information distribution network in a 30-mile radius. By Tuesday, Ada's phone started ringing. It was ringing from numbers she didn't even recognize. By Thursday, she had 12 hard cash deposits. By the following Monday, she had 19. She sat down at the kitchen table and did the hard math. She had 31 birds. 8 of them were smaller cockerels that needed until December to hit a good weight. She could comfortably fill 23 Thanksgiving orders. She hit 23 deposits, and she completely locked the gates. She stopped taking orders. She actually called people back, apologized, and turned away cash. She told them she could put them on a waitlist for December or next year. Turning away cash when you are broke feels incredibly wrong, but creating a hard limit on supply when demand is spiking is the ultimate flex in business. It drives people absolutely crazy. It makes them want it even more. Processing week hit right in the middle of November. Ada and Clotilde did it themselves by hand. It took them 3 full days. And this is the exact moment that massive premium price tag instantly justified itself in the real world. The physical difference in the product was jarring. The meat was incredibly dense. It was darker than anything you see in a grocery store. The fat wasn't that weird translucent white. It was heavy, rich, and distinctly yellow. When Ada pressed her hand against the dressed bird, it felt solid. There was no water weight. There was no chemical bloat. She looked at Clotilde. Clotilde just said you can tell when something actually lived. Loretta Gaines was the first pickup. She drove out from town, looked at the dressed bird, pressed the breast with her thumb, and looked at Ada. She said this is a real bird. She said she hadn't bought a real turkey in 12 years because the grocery stores ruined the market with cheap frozen garbage. She handed Ada folded cash. Her daughter immediately ordered 2 more for Christmas. On Thanksgiving Day, Ada took one of the oxidized copper birds, the heaviest one of the bunch, and roasted it. Clotilde's old oven ran exactly 12 degrees hot. It had been running 12 degrees hot since 1994. Clotilde didn't even tell Ada this until the bird was already inside. Ada just adjusted the timing. She adapted. When they sat down to eat, the truth of the entire experiment was on the plate. It didn't taste gamey. It didn't taste wild or strong. It tasted overwhelmingly full. It tasted like an animal that had been allowed to fully exist. Clotilde took a bite, chewed slowly, and said grocery store birds taste like almost turkey. Like something trying really hard to be a turkey but refusing to actually commit to it. She pointed her fork at the meat. She said this one committed? If you love seeing the underdog win by rejecting the cheap factory mindset and doing things the hard, right way, hit that like button right now to support the channel. It tells the algorithm that real quality still matters. The turkey tasted like a completely different animal. But the real explosion, the moment this went from a cool project to an actual unstoppable business, didn't happen on Thursday. It happened on Friday. Friday morning, the phone started ringing off the hook. And it wasn't the people who bought the birds who were calling. It was the people who ate at the tables of the people who bought the birds. This is the exact moment the flywheel effect kicked in. In traditional business, you have something called customer acquisition cost. CAC. It is the amount of money you have to set on fire to convince a total stranger to trust you enough to buy your product. Companies spend billions on ads trying to lower their CAC. Ada's CAC was absolute zero. The product itself was the marketing engine. When you build something that is undeniably, physically superior to the market standard, the growth curve just goes exponential without you spending a single dollar. Your customers become your sales team. A guy called from a Knoxville area code. He said he had been sitting at his sister's house in Granger on Thursday. He ate the turkey. He said it was unlike anything he had tasted since he was a kid. He didn't ask about the price. He just asked if he could get one. Ada said she had a few December birds left for $20 a pound. He said fine. This guy lived in a major city. He was willing to drive 40 minutes out into the country just to hand a 19-year-old girl cash because of a piece of meat he ate at someone else's house. The notebook filled up aggressively. Dennis from the co-op called. Harwell Pitts came back around and asked if she had any left. People who missed out on the first run were desperately trying to secure a spot for the next one. By the time January rolled around, Ada sat at the kitchen table and looked at her notebook. She had 61 names written down. 61 people begging to pay premium prices. She had 61 guaranteed sales. But here is the catch. She hadn't even bought the new flock yet. Clotilde looked at the massive list of names. She drank her coffee. She told Ada that Earl always used to say the hardest part was convincing people the very first time. After that, they just convince each other. Clotilde looked out the window at the 2 copper hens Ada had saved from the butcher block. She told Ada that the copper birds were the best ones she had because they foraged the widest and covered the most ground. She pointed out the brutal irony of the situation. The most wrong ones, the ones the entire auction room laughed at, turned out to be the absolute right ones. Ada had the demand. She had the premium pricing model locked in. But she needed a massive new supply to feed the machine. And that brings us to the Tuesday before Thanksgiving year 3. This is where you scale. Ada didn't change the formula. She just poured gasoline on it. When spring hit, she went out to the barn, pulled out the rest of Earl's rough sawn oak lumber from 1989, and built 3 massive new roost structures. She doubled the size of the pen. She extended the portable fencing out deep into the back pasture. She built it exactly the way Earl had built it decades ago, because the old ways worked. September arrived. Ada drove her beat-up truck straight back to the livestock auction. Cecil Boone saw her walk in and just shook his head. Word had gotten around the county. The room knew what she was doing now. The misfit pen was huge this year. People had actually started separating out the defective, odd-colored, strange-looking birds specifically for her. There were over 40 of them sitting there. Ada spotted a pale brown bird in the corner with a crooked foot. It was pacing the fence line with insane energy. She looked at Cecil and said she wanted all of them. She bought 42 wrong birds. Harwell Pitts was standing near the coffee machine again. He watched her load the heavy crates into the truck. He didn't laugh this time. When she drove past him on her way out of the dirt lot, he just raised his hand. It wasn't really a wave. It was an acknowledgement. One serious operator recognizing another. Ada processed 68 birds that November. 68 premium, pasture-raised, hyperdense birds. Then came the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Ada hadn't planned an event. She hadn't announced a specific pickup window. People just started showing up at the exact same time. The demand was so concentrated that cars started backing up. People with cash in their hands stacked up in the gravel driveway. The line of cars spilled out of the driveway and started stretching down Cutter Creek Road. Dozens of people standing out in the freezing cold November air, their breath turning to white clouds, just waiting for a turkey. Harwell Pitts pulled up in his heavy work truck. The driveway was completely blocked. He had to park his truck on the rough shoulder of the road. He got out. He zipped up his jacket. He looked at the massive line of cars. He looked at the people waiting patiently in the cold. And then the old man walked all the way to the back of the line and waited his turn. The same man who stood in the auction house 2 years earlier and loudly predicted her complete failure was now standing in the freezing cold, waiting to hand her top dollar for the exact same product he had laughed at. When Harwell finally made it to the front of the line, Ada handed him his bird. It was heavy. It was solid. It was real. Harwell looked at the bird. He looked at the 68 coolers lined up against the barn wall. He looked at Ada. He didn't smile. He just said that next year, he wanted to. Ada wrote his name in the notebook. She took the broken assets. She took the things the entire market said were completely worthless. She ignored the commodity race to the bottom. She poured in the sweat equity, she let biology do the heavy lifting, and she commanded a price that forced the world to respect the product. There are mispriced assets exactly like this hiding in plain sight in almost every single market on Earth right now, but you have to know exactly what to look for, and you have to have the nerve to buy them when everyone else in the room is laughing at you. I am breaking down a completely different massive hidden arbitrage opportunity in next week's video. Hit subscribe right now so you do not miss it.